So welcome to our webinar on pension fund ESG risk disclosures. For our listeners today, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions, and they will be answered at the end of the webinar. I'll now introduce Micheline Zion, who will introduce the speakers and moderate this webinar. Micheline.
Yes, thank you very much. Could you go to the third slide, I guess? Yes, so good morning, good afternoon, and even a good evening for some of you. Welcome to this webinar on pension fund environmental, social, and corporate governance risks. This webinar is sponsored by the Resource and Environment Task Force of the International Actuarial Association. It is my pleasure to introduce the three speakers today and authors of the IAA paper on pension fund ESG risk. We have Paul Mace. Paul, lead author of the paper, and is a member of the IAA Resource and Environment Task Force. Paul is an independent consultant and actuary and lives in the UK. He is the author of a number of IAA papers. Then we have Philip Shear, which is from Ireland, and also an actuary, and he's active with the IAA, but also with the Actuarial Association of Europe. Tim Ferlin, also an actuary, is from Australia. He focuses his practice on investment and pension plans, and is an active participant to the IAA. So now, without further delay, let's dive into the topic. Paul, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Micheline. Yeah, it was not so long ago that ESG would sort of put in the domain of an issue, an ethical issue, if you like, where pension funds weren't allowed to consider these sort of things. It was something to do with your own conscience. You could allow for them with your own money, but if you're acting as a trustee of the pension fund, you had to concentrate entirely on financial issues. That's all changed, and it's changed over the last few years, and now virtually every investment manager across the world claims to integrate environmental, social, and governance issues into their investment policies and processes, including the major pension funds, whether they're managing their own funds or using investment managers. Why has this happened? It's financial, because all these issues are potentially major risks for pension funds and their performance. Many studies have shown that allowing for ESG risks can enhance performance on a long-term basis or reduce volatility. It's a risk management exercise. And of course, apart from the direct financial implications, there's also risks, reputational risks for trustees and indeed for sponsors of pension schemes. If they are invested in a company where some major problem, environmental or social risk arises, there's an interest from the general public, but also there seems to be much more of an interest now from pension scheme members as to how their funds are being invested. And at the same time, the regulators are upping their game and courts are becoming more involved. And for actuaries, it's not just investment actuaries, it's also pension fund actuaries involved in funding and looking at the actual returns on the funds. In regard to the sponsors of pension funds, if the sponsor gets into trouble, then obviously that's going to cast out perhaps on future contributions to the pension fund, as this next slide illustrates. Next one, please, Christian. Yeah, this is an old case now. It's just 10 years old. Many will remember the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, which was caused devastating pollution across the southern United States. Although it's an old case, I think lessons can still be learned, because there were problems arising in all these ESG areas. Obviously a huge disaster, but they seems to have been caused by inadequate oversight, lack of concern about safety. Quite a number of people died apart from the devastating pollution caused due to changes by BP and also some of their suppliers. Next slide, please. Yeah, one time as this crisis developed, there was even concern about the very survival of BP, depending on how the actual litigation developed, because they had huge costs in terms of cleaning up the mess, but also paying damages to excuse me, to businesses and individuals in the countries affected. And of course, if you were a BP pension fund member and you hadn't yet retired, you may have had quite a few sleepless nights as to whether that generous pension scheme would carry on. Next slide, please. These are just a few other examples which have made the headlines. Obviously, Volkswagen was an amazing case, actually, where the company was involved in deceiving regulators as to the emissions from their cars. And this wasn't just one person or a few people. It seemed to have permeated almost throughout the company, which was highly unusual, I think. Then we've had a number of cases in the developing world where factories involved in producing goods, like garments and the like, for the developed world didn't have the health and safety and other standards which will be expected. And these give rise to the requirement, really, that if you're a multinational company, it's not just your own business you need to look out for, but also what your suppliers are doing to provide you with the products and goods which you're selling on to other people. The Sydney example was money laundering. It's obviously a criminal offence, a major issue, and that arose again. I suppose from an investment, if you're an investment manager, what you have to try and do in advising on these issues is try and identify the companies where these issues might arise. Not easy, obviously, but that's what you're paying them to do. You have to identify, is there an insular culture developing? Is there a lack of oversight, hubris? They can't do no wrong. Is there short-term thinking? Are the incentives just too short-term rather than looking at the long term? Next slide. Yeah, on this slide we've just listed some of the headings for ESG risks, and it's certainly not comprehensive, but you can see there are a lot of items on that list. Just taking some of them, waste production. Many mining companies have processes where they use a lot of water to refine the ore or whatever it is, and the water tends to get polluted, and what they do with it, well, they store it. And you had the examples in South America where dams of this polluted water gave way and flooded the local area and caused loss of life and destruction. Child and forced labour, that comes to the fore, and obviously a recent example here is the situation in China, where it's alleged that the Uyghurs are being used on a forced labour basis to produce cotton for many of the companies which are in the developed world. They rely on that source of cheap labour. COVID, of course, it comes into issues of health and safety. How are companies actually trying to protect the interests of their employees? We see that particularly in the retail sector currently, which in many countries in the food area has surprisingly managed to maintain supplies throughout the pandemic. but there are still concerns about whether they're doing sufficient to protect their staff. Board independence under governance is a very important issue, obviously. Are the directors carrying out their roles in supervising what the board, what the chief executive's strategy is, what his plans are? Are they? And those questions arose, I think, in the Volkswagen scandal, for example. If they've been there 10 years on the board, 10 years, 15 years, are they still doing that job? Are they still challenging? Or have they just become part of the furniture? Executive compensation, obviously a very controversial issue, but a very important issue. And the issue there is it too short term? Have you aligned the interests of the senior executives of the company with the interests of the shareholders, the pension funds who actually own the business? And that hasn't always been the case in the past. Next slide, please. These are the countries we've included in the survey. These are the main sources of funded pension schemes around the world. Some surprising cases where the amounts are quite relatively small, for example, France and Italy. But of course, these countries have large unfunded pension arrangements, so they don't contribute to this total. USA is obviously dominates, obviously because it's a large economy, but also perhaps slightly unusually, it has many public sector workers like teachers and municipal workers who are in funded pension schemes, and that contributes to their huge total. Whereas in other countries, like the UK, for example, where teachers and the health service workers are in unfunded schemes, so they don't contribute to the UK total. Next slide, please. These are the headings that we looked at in the survey of the 14 countries. And obviously, well, I suppose it's obvious, what we found is most of the funds were in respect of defined benefit schemes. And of course, with the trend to defined contribution, that is, if you like, a historical legacy, and the main growth area is now in defined contribution. And of course, it makes up the greater part anyway of the funds in Australia. Governance, there is normally a separation between the employer, the sponsor of the scheme, and the trustee, and the members. And typically, in many countries, the members would make up a section of the trustee body, maybe a third or half of the membership. They may not always be called trustees, but they operate as trustees. And we looked at the other areas there, and obviously in terms of developments in ESG legislation. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's work in progress, but the clear trend is towards more disclosure of the ESG risks right around the world. There's legislation already in some parts, Australia, Canada, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. Most of the legislation requires that the disclosure is not only to the members of the pension scheme, but also to the general public. So you have an additional level of oversight, including journalists, of course, which means there is people who look at these things quite closely. The SIP, the Statement of Investment Principles, is quite a common feature in various countries. And this is a document which is produced on a regular basis, showing how ESG principles are incorporated into the investment processes. The danger here, of course, is that you get a document which is relatively bland and just full of generalities. You know, we allow for ESG principles, we always incorporate them into our investment processes. So something like that is of no use whatsoever. the regulators are alert to these dangers, and they require that it is a meaningful document which reflects what actually happens in practice. And I think some of them will be asking questions as to what actually is done. In Europe, there is a lot happening, and a lot of directives, which Philip's going to be talking about shortly. The TCFD, this is the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosure. These recommendations, of course, came out in 2017, and they've received really a tremendous amount of support from companies, from corporations around the world, from regulators and from governments. But it is, those of you who've looked at the recommendations, they are complex, they are wide-ranging, and it's taking some time, understandably, for these to be adopted by companies and incorporated in their accounts, which is the recommendation. Pension funds, of course, rely on the companies in which they invest to adopt the recommendations so that they can look at the aggregate result in terms of the whole portfolio and can disclose the climate issues for the portfolio as a whole. So the pension funds are relying on the companies. So to that extent, they're delayed in terms of what they can do. But some pension funds are doing what they can with the information they've got. And of course, the thing about the TCFD, although it's a disclosure recommendation, what it effectively is a blueprint for how companies should tackle climate change. It's a bit of a misnomer. It actually tells you what to do in things like governance, strategy, risk management, and what metrics you might follow. I'm going to be talking about what some of the larger pension funds are doing a bit later on. As I say, the TCFD has been adopted, has been certainly supported, and it's starting to be made mandatory. The UK, for example, has just introduced legislation which will require TCFD recommendations to be followed by large companies and large pension funds. Right, I'll now ask, Philip is going to take over from me to talk about the European situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everybody. As Paul said, regulators have been active in this area, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'll just provide a brief overview, a very high-level overview of some of the regulatory developments in the recent past. Those of you in Europe will know all about IORP2. For those who aren't, IORP is the European Union's name for second pillar pension plans, which of course can take different forms in different member states of the European Union. This directive amended and significantly extended the original IORP directive, which dated from 2003. This updating directive came into force just over 4 years ago, and member states are required to implement this within 2 years by amending their national legislation. About half of them managed to do so, and to a certain extent this is reflected in the paper. As of now, the remainder, with the embarrassing exception of Ireland, have now completed the transposition of IORP2. The main focus of this directive is to enhance governance and to enable more effective supervision. But during the development of the directive, references to ESG were stitched into 6 of the articles, although the recital, which is not an official part of the directive, made it clear that IORPs were not obliged to follow an ESG investment strategy, but if they did not do so, they needed to explain why this was not appropriate. So the next slide, Christian, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Back one. Thank you. Okay, So what does IORP 2 require of pension funds in those 6 articles? There is an overarching reference to considering ESG in the general governance article, but there are more specific references in the investment rules and in the risk management section. Just to refer back to something Paul said in his initial remarks, the directive makes it clear to trustees or management boards of IORPs that ESG considerations can be included in the prudent person principle, which underpins the investment approach. There has been some debate about that, but the directive is intended to make it clear that that is a reasonable approach to adopt in considering the prudent person principle. Specific references to ESG must be included in the SIP, the Statement of Investment Policy Principles, and that in fact is a document which most IORPs must already provide, so it's an increase in the requirements of the SIP. The directive introduces for the first time a need for IORPs to have a risk management function and to produce an own risk assessment. So this is an entirely new section of the directive, and it includes references to ESG in both the risk management system and indeed in the risk assessment that must be produced. So next slide, please. So what about disclosure? The directive imposes a requirement to disclose publicly the annual report and accounts of the IORP and the SIP. Now, previously, this requirement was restricted to members and their representatives, but it is now, as Paul said, to be publicly available for consideration by analysts, journalists, etc., which should put more pressure on schemes to cover the issues in a clear and comprehensive manner. The SIP must be made publicly available as well, as I've said. The other requirement in the directive is disclosure to members, and the documentation given to prospective members or to actual members if they enroll automatically as part of their contract of employment must now include information on how ESG factors are considered in the investment approach. Now, that's obviously much more relevant in a DC context, where the impact of the investment strategy will feed through directly to the member outcomes, but also in a DB context, the trustees or the management board are required to explain why they have adopted the investment strategy they have in relation to ESG considerations. And of course, the supervisor has the right to request, or indeed may automatically be provided with, accounts, the SIP and the own risk assessment, and indeed other documents to ensure that they are able to assess how IORPs have discharged their responsibilities in relation to ESG disclosures. Next slide, please. So, moving on to the second Shareholders' Rights Directive, SRD2. This has recently come into effect. Now, this is a much wider application than pension plans. It applies to a broad range of institutional investors and addresses a range of issues designed to improve shareholder engagement. There is a specific reference to ESG, one I found in the text, as quoted here. And I think it's actually quite a good comment here that clearly greater involvement of shareholders in corporate governance can help to improve the performance of companies, obviously including as regards ESG factors. Next slide. So how does this impact on pension funds? For a pension fund, the Shareholders' Rights Directive requires that they publicly disclose an engagement policy, how this is implemented, how this has been implemented, how they have voted, certainly on significant issues, how their equity investment strategy contributes to long-term performance, and the main features of their arrangements with any investment managers who manage their assets. So this additional disclosure, I guess, will probably be included in either the annual report or the SIP, both of which, of course, will now be publicly available. Next slide, please, Christian. Just very briefly, a couple of more bits of legislation. It says in the pipeline they're sort of being rolled out. They're in effect, but haven't yet fully been implemented or brought into effect. The Sfdr, yet another acronym, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. This is coming into effect over the coming months, March 2021 for a substantial part of it. It applies to financial market participants and will require disclosure of information in relation to sustainability risks. For IORPs, some, but probably not all of this information would already be disclosed in the SIP. And very importantly, underpinning the EU sustainability agenda is the taxonomy, which has begun and is being rolled out. And this will define the terminology relevant to ESG considerations, sustainability considerations. And that has the objective of achieving consistency and in particular outlawing greenwashing of investment products. Next slide, please. Just moving outside Europe, just for completeness, a couple of years ago, the International Organization of Pension Supervisors undertook a consultation, which the IAA contributed to, and they subsequently produced guidelines for supervisors on the integration of ESG factors in the investment and risk management of pension funds. That clarified, again, to come back to the point that I made earlier, that the integration of ESG factors is in line with the fiduciary duties of trustees or the management board of a pension plan. It is not, as Paul was commenting earlier, it's no longer considered just an ethical issue or a fad. It is an important financial and risk management factor. And the guidelines indicated that supervisors should require that investment policy integrates ESG factors and that there is appropriate reporting and disclosure to members of engagement with the companies in which they invest. Also, not just in relation to ESG factors, I think, but it did encourage trustees and management boards to use scenario testing of investment strategy. So those are guidelines for supervisors. They have no legal force as such, but they are in the public domain, and there's quite a nice short document if you want to read something further. So with that, I'll hand back to Paul.
Thank you, Philip. I put this slide up because I think it's quite revolutionary. It's apologies because it is the UK, but it's produced by our main financial regulator last year, and for the use of all financial institutions, so pension funds and insurance companies, and indeed other funds, charities, or whatever. But it's a one-sentence definition of what you should be doing when you're managing investments on behalf of somebody else. You're the steward of the investment. And the interesting thing, I think, is in that last line. You're creating long-term value for clients, but it's leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment, and society. So setting your stewardship role in a much wider context than you might have found in the past. You know, a few years ago as actuaries, we were told that the requirement is to maximize the investment return with an acceptable degree of risk. There's nothing about benefiting the wider society or the environment or the wider economy that comes to that. So it is a revolutionary approach, but it hasn't just gone out on the limb. It has been adopted. It actually follows on from an earlier code, but this one is much more radical in that sense. It has been adopted by many large pension funds and other institutions. And interestingly, it follows, or it goes along with similar developments in other countries, including Australia, India, Japan, and Switzerland. It's also similar to the approach adopted by the United Nations organization, there's an organization called the UNPRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, which you can sign up to as an investment manager or a pension fund. And almost all investment managers right around the world have signed up to that, which requires that they report on their approach to ESG and engagement on a regular basis, including in America. Most of the large investment managers in America have done that as well. Despite the fact, as we saw earlier, there's no, as yet, I don't think there's any national ESG legislation in America, although that may change, of course, in the coming years. Next slide, please. And if you're thinking that pension funds are maybe getting too evangelical, I think what this slide demonstrates is that institutional investors are really following what companies are doing. You know, for some years now, companies in their mission statements have set out some very ambitious, if you like, but also wide-ranging statements. They're not only looking to, grow the business for the benefit of the shareholders, but they're looking to do something for the benefit of society as a whole. They certainly don't want to be a negative influence. You look at Walmart, safe, affordable products, people around the world, to encourage, support social sustainability in local communities for our business and for society. So it's what the stewardship code is very much in line with the thinking surrounding these sort of documents. I mean, it includes a company like, I think, Siemens and Unilever. I think their corporate philosophies have been quite wide-ranging for quite a number of years. But most of these other large companies, which you wouldn't perhaps expect to have such a philosophy, have indeed got one now. It's right to be skeptical. Greenwashing, which is the idea that a company or a fund or whatever likes to present itself as being green to its customers, etc., but is actually not quite living up to its claims. You've got to look at what actually they do in practice, obviously, but the statements they make and the disclosures they make under legislation or whatever, give you evidence in which you can test their claims and go back to them if it doesn't seem to be consistent with what their claims are. Tim's now going to be talking about how pension funds approach some of these issues in practice.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everyone. If I can have the next slide, please. What I'm going to start by doing is talking a little bit about some of the investment concepts and approaches that are here with ESG. The first point there is integrating ESG into the investment strategy and approach. I think we've touched on that a little bit with what Paul and Philip have said, that there are significant risks that are covered by ESG, and it is becoming a lot more mainstream. So this is really just about good risk management and keeping up with the rest of the market. There's a bit of a saying in investment management that you don't want to take on unrewarded risk, coming out of the capital asset pricing model and the idea that you can diversify away risks, and those risks that you can diversify away you don't earn returns on. ESG is becoming a risk of that sort, that if everyone is out there doing it and you're not, then you're potentially exposed to risk that you're not getting rewarded for. So it's almost a need to play these days. The next point there is around divestment or engagement, which has been a little bit of a debate, particularly around kind of the do good, which was, if we go back the slide, please, around the idea that you want to avoid certain investments that reflect your particular values. Engagement, on the other hand, is working with companies, the investment managers talking to management to encourage them to pick up areas that might be risks. the asset owners, whether it's the pension funds or the investment managers, actually in voting on shareholder resolutions to encourage companies to do the right things around some of these risks. So that's again about improving returns, looking to manage some of these risks to deliver on returns from these companies. So again, it is really about something financial rather than just about doing good when we're talking about engagement. The next sort of steps that we've seen are probably more thematic type portfolios. And the examples that we've got there is of low carbon portfolios. So we're seeing investors say that they want to measure and manage the carbon exposure that they have in their investment portfolios, have an exposure that's less than what the index might otherwise be. Again, I think the issues there are financial as well as the values of those organisations. I think you can take the view that, and those investors are taking the view that the risks around carbon aren't necessarily priced into markets as well as they should be. And so it's something that they want to take a portfolio position on. Again, when you're investing, you've got to be very, very smart to beat the market. You're trying to beat all the other smart people that are out there. So what you certainly don't want to do is ignore what others in the market are saying and the sorts of positions that they're taking. So the fact that there are investors out there going, we need to look at some of these themes, we need to adjust our portfolios, says that it's something that's important that that you want to have on your radar to think about doing. It's really only when we get to the last point and talk about social impact that questions about returns versus doing the right thing starts to come in. When you are talking about socially responsible investing, taking positions that are perhaps based on more of an ethical view, then there does become a question about returns. But even there, I'd say that you can make investments of that sort with a focus on returns. So it doesn't have to be solely about doing good, and it doesn't have to come at the cost of returns. But you do certainly need to be more aware of returns if you're trying to bias a portfolio in that direction. We can have the next slide, please. So one of the questions that kind of came up as we were doing this piece of work is, what can smaller pension funds do? Because a lot of actuaries will be out there working with smaller pension funds. It's obviously a lot easier for larger pension funds that have big investment teams to do more in this space. But small pension funds, I think there are things that they can do. We've said really it's about starting with an understanding of what's going on, talking to your existing investment managers, understanding what their positions on ESG are, what they're doing, how their voting is organised. So I'd say improving understanding is the first step, and really something that you would expect investment managers to do if this is really all about good risk management. When you've got that understanding, then the next step that you might look at is, can you fill the gaps? If you're not happy with the ESG approach that managers are taking with the risk management they've got around there, then you can compare and contrast with other investment managers, and you may take a different view about the investment managers that you want to use. You can also start then to talk to your members about what it is that you're doing and talk to other stakeholders about the approach. Have the next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk about was just some of the litigation that's out there. And in particular, there's a good example from Australia that's very relevant to pension funds. It's worth spending a little bit of time on. So there has been a lot of litigation out there around climate change. Interestingly, a lot of it's in the United States. Most of that hasn't involved pension funds, but in Australia, we have had one case with REST, which is industry superannuation fund covering employees in the retail sector. It's about a $60 billion industry fund, so reasonable sized fund, and that's kind of the way superannuation's going in Australia, that there's a lot of consolidation and a smaller number of larger funds like that. The particular case was run by a member of the fund as being the individual that has an interest in what the pension fund's doing, but they were supported by an interest group, which is an interesting theme that we've seen, that there are climate change environmental interest groups out there that are encouraging their supporters and their members to ask their pension funds about what they're doing about climate change. So we do think this is a trend that we're going to see more of, and there's money in some of those organisations to run some of these legal cases. One of the interesting things that I found about that case is it did actually start with disclosure, which was the topic of the paper we're talking about today. It then shifted as the case progressed to be not just about disclosure, but also about the trustee duties, which goes back to one of the comments that Philip had about trustee duties and the responsible persons tests and the like. The view that was put forward in the case was that to cover those sorts of trustee obligations of acting in the member's best interests is one of the obligations we've got down here, then you really do need to be considering all the risks that are out there and factoring those things into your portfolios. Doesn't mean you need to avoid all coal or reduce carbon in the portfolio, but it means that you can't just be going on ignorant of the risks. So it does tend to start with smaller things. Now that case ended up in a settlement, so we don't have precedent out of that that's sort of going to inform future legal cases, but we do have some information in terms of the way the case was approached and the sorts of commitments that REST made to settle that case. One of the first commitments they made was that they're going to target a net zero carbon footprint by 2050. Now, a number of governments have come out and actually said they're going to target zero carbon by 2050 or net zero carbon by 2050. So that commitment isn't necessarily doing anything more than we would expect portfolios of the world to be by 2050. But interestingly, besides REST, a number of other large superannuation funds in Australia have come out with the same sort of commitment. Importantly, the next step then is actually disclosure. So disclosing progress towards that commitment. There was mention of the TCFD disclosure requirements and trying to comply with them to allow members to have a look at that progress. And then some, not massive steps, but important steps around improving voting on shareholder resolution, working with investment managers, and taking some progress towards that longer term commitment. So it wasn't fundamental groundbreaking change that they needed to make to make that settlement, but it was progress, and it was around managing risks and disclosure and taking some of those steps that I talked about on the previous slide. With that, I might hand back to Paul. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about best practice in relation to 7 particular pension funds who are going to be galloping away into the future. But next slide, please, Christian. Yeah, we've chosen these. It's a random selection as examples of best practice from some of the major pension funds. These are not necessarily the best funds. They could have chosen others, but I think they are examples of current best practice from around the world. You can see they're all pretty large funds. Some of them are very large indeed. One of the issues actually is despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact they are so large, they still collaborate. And on that right-hand column, you can see the sort of collaborations, the acronyms of the organizations they get involved with. Just looking at a few of them, Climate Action 100 Plus is an organization which is looking to target the 100 largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, and get them or engage with them on the basis that that they produce strategies, obviously, to reduce their emissions, and on a realistic basis, so the business can still survive in a climate changed world, and it won't contribute any more than they have to making that worse. So that's one of them, Climate Action 100 Plus. CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, that's an organization which is encouraging disclosure of carbon emissions by companies according to defined categories and reliable methodologies. And they also help companies actually compute their disclosures. And PRI, mentioned before, the UN Principles Responsible Investment, which is supported by most large pension funds. What do they disclose then, these best practice organizations? It's a responsible investment report which they produce on a regular basis, normally on an annual basis, that sets out their whole approach to ESG and also their activities in terms of engaging with the companies in which they invest, the issues which they've engaged with them, and the outcome. These, I mean, taken together, of course, these are some, they are substantial shareholders, so they have substantial interest, influence on these companies. And of course, formally, with a corporation, there's various opportunities where the shareholders have opportunities to vote on activities. So they vote to accept or not the report and accounts, the election or continuation of directors, and also directors' remuneration in most cases. So there's plenty of opportunities, apart from on the more informal basis, to formally register your approval or disapproval of the directors' actions. And we've seen that as a rising level of activity, not just by the large funds, but all pension funds on some of these issues. As I say, there's more in our paper. If you read the full paper, there's more details of what these are actually doing. Next slide, please. It's my final slide. Yeah, as we've seen, the pension funds are the owners of these corporations. They have responsibilities as to what the company is doing on their behalf in the way of future returns. So that's obviously the justification for why they're getting involved. Also, there's a thinking. I suppose it's you could almost call it a democratization of the pension fund world. It's a slightly inappropriate word, but where people are saying, well, it's all very well me saving for my pension in 20, 30 years' time, but I want to retire. I want to get a decent pension, but I want to retire in a world which is going to be fit to live in, which brings in some of these other issues. The disclosures we've talked about, they do demonstrate the stewardship of the company and the stewardship of the pension fund. If you don't take these into account, they will come back to bite you, as we've seen. And the actuaries, it affects you obviously directly if you're an investment actuary, and if you're a pension fund actuary, it's going to affect you in terms of the monies available to fund the pension scheme, and also whether the sponsor is going to be able to carry on funding it. There was a report last year from the World Economic Forum on risk, and their report came out with, they said the 5 top risks in terms of likelihood were all environmental, and the top risk in terms of impact was climate. Now, of course, with hindsight, we can look back, and this report came out a year ago before the pandemic. With hindsight, we can see there was an elephant in the room, which they missed, like many of us. But I think we can be sure that when COVID is under control and is managed, these environmental risks will still be there and will still need to be properly addressed and disclosed. Thank you. And I'll hand back to Micheline, who's going to be handling our question and answer session.
Micheline, are you there?
Are you there, Micheline?
Yes.
Oh.
Sorry, it's this idea of you need to put the mic on if you're talking. Yes. So I was saying that if you have questions, there's the button. A reminder that there's the button at the bottom of your screen to type your questions in, and we'll be delighted to answer them. We have Mike Clark that has been posting questions and sometime information. So I also, if you want to look at what Mr. Clark is saying, then you can also do that. Not many of them are questions, so there's at least one not exactly related to pension, but nevertheless I'll ask just in case you guys have an answer to that. Basically asking whether the panelists see any examples of governments, such as chief risk officers for their nation balance sheet, seeking to manage the fiscal risk of climate change. And he's basically saying that there's some efforts in that direction, although very modest in the UK. So any thoughts on that, or no? Any volunteer?
I'll answer the New Zealand bit to say that I can't answer the New Zealand bit being from Australia. Not that familiar with if there is anything going on in New Zealand. From the Australian perspective, we're unfortunately a bit like the US in that politically we're a little bit behind on climate change efforts right at the moment. So there's nothing in this particular area from Australia that I'd point out at this point.
Yeah, just to say from the perspective of Ireland, we are environmentally conscious, I suppose. The Green Party is part of our coalition government at the moment, so it's going to be on the agenda. And the government does have a number of longer term ambitions around the usual stuff, electric cars. We have just, I think, this morning announced that we are going to stop harvesting peat from the bogs, which is obviously a good move, and a number of other things. But I guess, like most countries, the climate change agenda has been pushed a little bit aside by managing the fiscal burden of the COVID-19 supports that are required for the economy, so that it's still there, and I guess as time moves on, but some concrete steps, as I say, are being taken around increasing renewable energy and cutting back on, as I say, peat harvesting and the use of coal-fired generation.
Yeah, my experience, I think perhaps being slightly unfair on the UK, because I think the UK has just introduced this legislation on the TCFD recommendations, which I think is probably one of the first governments in the world to do that. Because they're very keen, because the next climate change meeting is in the UK towards the end of this year, so they want to make a good impression. But there have been other developments around the world, haven't there? Like in China, they've set a target is at 2060 to get to net zero, which is a long way off. But of course, China, although it's a huge economy, is a developing economy, and there's a huge chunk of their population who are living on a very low wage, and and not contributing very much to emissions compared with people in the Western world. So have been a number, and also in China, I think they've invested more in renewables than all the other nations put together. So although they've contributed a lot to global warming in terms of coal, as we have, they are doing a lot to mitigate that as well. I was looking at something, I think, going back to the 19th century, I think the UK was responsible for, what was it? It was certainly the majority of the world's emissions were coming from the UK, a small country. In the 19th century, it was responsible for most of the emissions. So I think you could say the UK has got a lot to answer for. So it's quite right that we are taking the lead in some respects now, at least.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have another question from Christopher Sutton. By the way, there is Mike Clark that may want to talk about some of the papers in IFOA. So the Secretariat, the question to you is, can we open his mic? So if you could look at this while we're looking at the Mr. Sutton question, and then we'll get back to this. So the question is any thoughts on pension sponsors in the pensions needing to take ESG into account in design of funds offering for members, including incorporate it into default of funds?
I'd say yes, definitely it needs to be taken into account. Working in Australia, where superannuation is primarily DC, we are seeing strong member demand for these sorts of issues. There are even some specialist pension funds that have set up that are solely focused on ESG related issues. We've got ethical pension funds, we've got a low carbon or zero carbon pension fund that's been set up around that on the basis of member demand, and they're doing quite well. That members are moving their money to those funds. So whether it's in a default or whether it's in an offering or a specialist fund, obviously will depend on the particular circumstances, but I don't think anyone in the DC space can be thinking about issues of investment option design and default design without having this as one of the factors I think about.
Just to add to that, certainly in Ireland, ESG compliant funds are certainly much more common than they were 2 or 3 years ago. And indeed, the Society of Actuaries in Ireland did call on government to ensure that the default fund in the automatic enrolment plan, which will be rolled out sometime, should be ESG compliant. I think there's been a concern in the past about greenwashing, that anybody could put forward a fund and call it ESG compliant and nobody could really check. But hopefully with the development of the taxonomy and clear definitions of what is and isn't, this will become more acceptable to trustees to offer these funds, because they can be sure that they do meet the required standards.
Okay. Paul, you want to add something to this, or we're passing
Yeah,
the...
yeah. I was thinking, because as we know with these DC pension schemes in particular, the default fund is so important, because inevitably the great majority of members will actually go into the default fund. So the design of that fund and how it's constructed is actually of fundamental importance. And I don't know whether Chris Sutton is suggesting that there should be perhaps I don't know, legislation or encouragement for the default fund to incorporate ESG. So it's like that's the default. If you don't like ESG, you want to I don't know why you wouldn't, but if you didn't like it, you had to opt out of that fund. Whether that should be a requirement, I'm not aware that anyone's actually, the legislation is in that area, but maybe it should.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So Mike, Mr. Mike Clark. You can, I guess, open your mic and speak a bit about the IFOE material. We don't have too much time, though. If you could be brief, that would be much appreciated. Mr. Clark, you want to open your mic? Or Secretariat, if the problem is with the Secretariat, can you make sure that Mr. Clark can open his mic?
Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Just to promote the IFOA curated climate reading list, full disclosure, I wrote it. This was promoted to help actuaries who wanted to learn a bit more about climate risk, and it covers a range of issues. I'm actually promoting it beyond the profession. So that's just a resource you can get from the IFO website. And just sort of picking up a couple of points which add detail to some of the presenters' points. You know, we have central banks disinvesting from Australian and Canadian state government bonds. We have a guide for trustees by the IIGCC. So there are lots of sort of data points that support the survey and the work that the panelists have shown. And I mean, if it's appropriate, you know, I'm an actuary, if it's appropriate, very happy that anybody's interested, possibly through Michelin, you know, can sort of get in touch with me later. But some of the comments I posted on the chat are data points building on what Tim, Philip and Paul have said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is, we're now already past the hour, so thank you all for your participation. Thank you for the authors to being having great presentation, and it's very interesting and very timely topic. So we hope to see you in our next webinar from the Resource and Environment Task Force of the IAA. So have a good time, take care, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.